On April 16, 1851, a nor'easter tore across the Massachusetts coast with sustained winds that turned the Atlantic into a weapon. Two men were inside the Minot's Ledge lighthouse, a 70-foot iron tower standing on 9 legs bolted into a rock that vanished underwater at high tide. The tower had been swaying for hours. Joseph Antoine and Joseph Wilson, the two assistant keepers, had sent the head keeper ashore days earlier because he was ill. They were alone. Somewhere in the early hours of April 17th, one of them scratched a message and sealed it in a bottle. The records say it read something close to this: "The lighthouse cannot last any longer. She is shaking a good 3 feet each way as I write. God bless you all." Before dawn, the central iron support snapped. The lantern, the house, the whole structure dropped into the ocean. When morning came, there was nothing left on Minot's Ledge but 9 bent stumps of iron sticking out of the rock. Joseph Antoine's body washed up on Cohasset's shore. Joseph Wilson's body was found nearby. They were young men. They had kept the light burning until the tower fell out from under them. That was the end of the first Minot's Ledge lighthouse. It was not the end of Minot's Ledge. Within months, the United States Lighthouse Board looked at the wreckage and made a decision that most engineers of the era considered impossible. They would go back to the same rock, the same 25-foot wide shelf of granite that spent 20 hours a day underwater, and they would build a new lighthouse. Not from iron this time, from stone. 2,500 blocks of Quincy granite, each weighing approximately 2 tons, dovetailed together with such precision that no mortar would hold the tower together. Gravity would. The weight of the stone itself, locked in place by the geometry of the cuts, would resist breaking surf that reaches 100 feet in height. That tower was finished in 1860. It is still standing right now, 1 mile off Cohasset, Massachusetts, flashing its light across the Atlantic. But Minot's Ledge was not the only impossible rock where Americans decided to stack granite against the ocean. Between 1850 and 1890, the United States built a series of offshore stone lighthouses along both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. These were not buildings placed on solid ground near the water. These were towers erected on rocks that disappeared at high tide, on ledges 600 feet from any landing point, on basalt pillars surrounded by surf that could kill a man in seconds. The granite blocks were ferried out at low tide, lifted by hand-cranked derricks, and fitted with sub-quarter-inch precision so they would interlock against the force of the sea. Workers on some of these projects could work only 90 minutes per day, because that was all the tide would allow. Men died building them. Men spent decades living inside them after they were built. This is the story of those lighthouses, those rocks, and the men who refused to let the ocean win. If stories like this matter to you, the kind where the names and the numbers and the cost are remembered, I hope you will subscribe to this channel. We do not forget these men. We do not rush past them. To understand why anyone would attempt something as reckless as stacking 2-ton granite blocks on a rock that spends most of its existence underwater, you have to understand what the ocean was doing to the ships. Between 1817 and 1847, an estimated 40 lives and $364,000 in property were lost in shipwrecks in the immediate vicinity of Minot's Ledge alone. That is a single reef off a single stretch of Massachusetts coast. In October of 1849, the ship St. John struck the rocks near Cohasset and sank within sight of shore. 99 Irish immigrants drowned. They had crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean and died within view of the country they had come to live in. The first attempt at a lighthouse on Minot's Ledge was the iron pile structure that Antoine and Wilson died inside. Captain William H. Swift of the Topographical Engineers had designed it. Swift believed it was impossible to build a stone tower on a ledge that was only 25 feet wide and dry for 2 or 3 hours a day. So he built a spidery iron frame instead, drilling 9 holes into the rock and setting iron legs into them like stilts. The idea was that waves would pass through the open framework without catching enough surface to push the tower over. The idea was wrong. The tower swayed 2 feet in either direction during storms. The first keeper, Isaac Dunham, reported that the structure was unsafe and demanded reinforcements. When none came, he resigned. His replacement, Captain John Bennett, agreed the tower was dangerous and filed his own reports. Bottom diagonal braces were partially installed, 6 out of 32, before funding ran out. The remaining 26 braces were never added. On the night of the collapse, the 2 assistant keepers rang the fog bell by hand through the storm. They kept the light burning. They did their jobs until the structure failed beneath them. After the collapse, the lighthouse board faced a simple question with a terrifying answer. The iron tower had failed. A stone tower was the only alternative. But Captain Swift had already declared that a stone tower could not be built on the ledge. The rock was too small, too exposed, too frequently submerged. The English had done it at Eddystone, off the coast of Plymouth, and at Bell Rock, off Scotland. But those were British engineering feats, and the Americans had never attempted anything comparable in open water. The man who took the job was Captain Barton Stone Alexander of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The design came from General Joseph Totten, chief engineer of the Army Corps, a man whose career had been built on fortifications, and who understood granite the way a sculptor understands marble. Totten designed a tower where the first 40 feet would be almost solid stone, a cylinder of interlocking granite so heavy that its own weight would pin it to the ledge. The blocks would be dovetailed, meaning each stone was cut with angled joints so it locked into the stones beside it and above it and below it. Iron dowels would anchor the courses together. No mortar, no cement in the structural joints. Just stone fitted to stone, with a tolerance of less than 1/4 inch, held in place by geometry and mass. Captain Alexander began work in the spring of 1855. The first task was cutting the top of the ledge flat to receive the foundation stones. This alone took years. The ledge was only exposed at low tide, and only during calm seas, which meant workers could be on the rock for brutally short windows. Captain Alexander described the requirements himself. 3 things were necessary, he wrote: a perfectly smooth sea, a dead calm, and low spring tides. This could only occur 6 times during any one lunation, 3 at full moon and 3 at the change. During the season of 1855, the total number of hours worked on the ledge was 130. The entire season. 130 hours. In 1856, they managed 157 hours. In 1857, 130 hours again. In 1858, 208 hours. Think about that for a moment. A full construction season, from spring through fall, and the total productive time on the rock was the equivalent of 3 work weeks. 90 minutes here, 2 hours there. The men would row out from Cohasset Harbor in the early morning, land on the wet ledge, and begin chiseling. The rock smelled of salt and seaweed. The spray from the swells soaked them before they had driven the first iron wedge. They worked with cold hands on cold stone, and they could hear the tide coming back before they could see it. A change in the rhythm of the waves against the ledge, a deepening of the sound. When the water started to cover the rock, they dropped their tools and climbed into the boats. Then they would wait for the next calm, low tide and try again. Meanwhile, the granite was being cut and assembled on Government Island in Cohasset Harbor, which was connected to the mainland. Stonecutters from Quincy, Massachusetts, the finest granite workers in the country, shaped each block to fit its exact position in the tower. They built the lighthouse on dry land first, assembling the courses to verify the fit, then disassembled it and hauled the blocks by oxen to a vessel that would carry them out to the ledge. Every single stone was numbered. Every single stone had one position it belonged in, and no other. Captain Alexander had a setback in January of 1857 when a ship called the New Empire wrecked on the rocks and destroyed the iron scaffolding that had been erected on the ledge. The impact damaged the rock itself. Alexander was discouraged. He wrote that if wrought iron would not stand it, he had his fears about a stone tower. But he went back. He always went back. The first granite block was laid on the ledge on July 9, 1857. A Cohasset diver named Captain Michael Neptune Brennick was hired as the chief safety officer because waves regularly swept workers off the rock during placement operations. Brennock's job was to pull men out of the water before the sea took them. The cornerstone was laid on October 2, 1858, with a formal ceremony at Government Island. Captain Alexander spoke. The great orator Edward Everett spoke. Everett recalled the night the first tower fell and the two keepers died. Through the summers of 1858, 1859, and 1860, the tower rose, course by course. Each block was brought from Government Island on a stone sloop captained by Nichols Tower of Cohasset. At the ledge, the blocks were hoisted by a derrick and steam engine, swung into position, and locked into place. The coppersmith for the bronze lantern dome was Erastus Beethoven Badger, founder of the E.B. Badger Company of Boston. The precision of the stonework was extraordinary. When inspectors examined the exterior joints years later, they found them exactly as they had been laid, without flaw or blemish. The ocean had been beating against the tower for decades and had not opened a single seam. The lantern of the second Minot's Ledge Lighthouse was first tested on August 22, 1860, and formally established on November 15th of that year. The tower stands 114 feet above the ledge. The total cost was approximately $300,000, which made it the most expensive lighthouse ever built in the United States at that time. 2,500 granite blocks, 5 years of construction, thousands of hours of stone cutting, and a tower that would outlast every storm the Atlantic could produce. In 1894, the light received a new rotating Fresnel lens that produced a flashing pattern. Someone, and the records do not tell us who, decided the flash sequence would be 1, 4, 3. 1 flash, then 4 flashes, then 3 flashes. The number of letters in the words, "I love you." The keepers called it the "I love you" light. Couples along the Cohasset shore watched for the pattern at night. They still do. 1, 4, 3. I have stood on the cliff at Cohasset and watched Minot's Ledge flash that pattern across the dark water, and I can tell you that the light is steady and the rhythm is unmistakable. 1, then 4, then 3. But Minot's Ledge was only one rock. 600 miles up the coast, off the southern shore of Maine, sits Boone Island. It is not so much an island as it is a flat slab of granite, 300 feet by 700 feet, rising only 14 feet above sea level at its highest point, 6 miles from the mainland. There are no trees, no shelter, no soil, just rock and the ocean beating against it from every direction. The history of Boone Island is a history of disaster. In 1710, the ship Nottingham Galley ran aground there, and the crew was forced to resort to cannibalism before rescue arrived. The first day marker was erected in 1799. The ocean washed it away within 5 years. A stone beacon replaced it. A lighthouse was built in 1811, 32 feet tall. The sea destroyed that one too. Another was built in 1831. The sea damaged that one as well. In 1855, the Lighthouse Board erected the current tower, a conical granite column 133 feet tall, with a focal plane 137 feet above mean high water. It was, and remains, the tallest lighthouse in all of New England. The construction methods were similar to Minot's ledge. Granite blocks, dovetailed, fitted with precision, stacked against the weather. But Boone Island presented its own particular cruelty. The rock was not submerged like Minot's ledge, but it was low enough that violent seas could heave boulders clear across its surface, demolishing structures that had taken years to build. Storms did not just batter Boone Island, they rearranged it. The keepers who served at Boone Island lived there with their families, at least for a time. The keeper's dwelling was a stone house that leaked so badly it was essentially uninhabitable during storms. The granite walls were torn down and rebuilt in 1889. A second story added, and still the damp crept in. A 1,200-pound fog bell sat atop the oil house and had to be rung by hand in response to signals from passing vessels. Imagine that duty in winter. Standing on a rock 6 miles from shore, in freezing spray, ringing a bell that weighed more than half a ton, knowing that if a ship heard your bell and turned in time, the crew would live, and if they did not hear it, they would die on the same rocks you were standing on. One of the longest-serving keepers at Boone Island was William C. Williams, who arrived as a second assistant in 1885, rose to principal keeper by 1888, and served until 1911. 26 years on a rock in the Atlantic. Williams kept the light through blizzards, nor'easters, weeks of isolation when supply boats could not reach the island. He watched the granite tower flex in hurricane-force winds. He heard the surf hit the base of the tower with a sound like cannon fire. And he stayed. Year after year, Williams stayed, because the light had to burn, and someone had to tend it. There's a story from Boone Island, and I have not been able to confirm the exact date, but the records suggest it happened sometime in the middle of the 19th century. A keeper fell ill and died while stationed on the island. His wife was alone. She tended the light herself, climbing the 133 feet to the lantern room, trimming the wick, keeping the flame alive, because she knew that ships were passing in the dark, and lives depended on that light. She did this for days. When a rescue vessel finally reached the island, they found her wandering the rocks, her mind broken by grief and isolation. She had kept the light burning until she could not keep herself upright. I have ridden out to Boone Island in calm seas, and even on a gentle day, the rock feels wrong. It feels too small, too flat, too exposed. The tower rises from it like a needle from a thimble. You look at it, and your first thought is that the ocean will take it, eventually. Your second thought is that it has been there since 1855, and the ocean has not taken it yet. That is the difference between what the ocean wants and what the granite allows. Now we go west, 3,000 miles west, to the Oregon coast, where the Pacific is not the Atlantic. The Pacific off Oregon does not batter. It annihilates. In 1878, Congress appropriated $50,000 for a lighthouse to mark the approaches to the Columbia River Bar, one of the most dangerous river entrances on the continent. The original plan was to build on Tillamook Head, a 1,000-foot cliff between Seaside and Cannon Beach. But surveyors realized the headland was too tall. Fog would obscure a light placed at that elevation. So they looked at Tillamook Rock. Tillamook Rock is a basalt pillar less than 1 acre in size, rising roughly 100 feet from the Pacific Ocean, 1.2 miles offshore from Tillamook Head, 20 miles south of the Columbia River mouth. The sides are nearly vertical. The surf around the base is constant and violent. Sea lions covered every surface. The rock had never been inhabited by humans. In 1879, the Lighthouse Board sent a surveyor named H.S. Wheeler to assess the rock. Wheeler's first report said that access to the rock was severely limited, if not impossible. He was ordered to try again. On his second attempt, he managed to land but could not move his equipment without a tape line. He reported that the rock would need considerable blasting to create a level surface for a foundation, and that costs would far exceed the original appropriation. Then came the third survey. In September of 1879, the board sent John Trewavas, an English master mason who had worked on the Wolf Rock Lighthouse off Cornwall. Trewavas knew wave-swept construction. He had done it before. He arrived at Tillamook Rock, attempted to land, and was swept off the rock by a swell. His body was never recovered. He was the first man to die for this lighthouse, and the lighthouse did not yet exist. The death of Trewavas nearly killed the project. Public opinion turned against it. Workers in the region refused to go near the rock. The construction foreman, Charles A. Ballantyne, could not hire local men. He eventually recruited a crew of quarrymen from outside the area, men who knew nothing about Trewavas or how he died. They waited at Fort Canby near Ilwaco, Washington, for a break in the weather. On October 12, 1879, they made the crossing and landed on Tillamook Rock. George Easterbrook oversaw the engineering of the construction. The first task was to blast the rounded top of the basalt pillar flat enough to lay a foundation. The quarrymen built wooden shelters on the wet, sloping surface and began dynamiting. The work was constant danger. Getting on and off the rock required a breeches buoy rigged to a derrick line strung between the rock and the supply ship. Everything, every tool, every barrel of water, every pound of food, every stick of dynamite came across that line, dangling over the surf. In January of 1880, 4 months into construction, a storm sent waves loaded with loosened rock crashing over the work site. The supply house was swept away. The workers were marooned on the rock for 16 days, with dwindling food and no way to reach the mainland. No resupply, no rescue. Just the rock and the Pacific, and the question of how long the food would last. They survived. They went back to work. By the end of May 1880, the top of the rock had been leveled. The cornerstone was laid on June 22nd. 2 derricks ferried equipment and materials by cable from supply ships standing well off the rock. The cutter Corwin and the steam schooners Mary Taylor and George Harley rotated duty as transport vessels. Workers unloaded everything from ashlar stone blocks to clean sand, fog signal boilers, and the delicate first-order Fresnel lens, all swung across on cables over open water. Construction took over 500 days. 6 workers died during the building of Tillamook Rock Lighthouse. I do not know all their names. The records are incomplete. What I know is that 6 men went to that rock to build something and did not come home. They are not memorialized on any monument I have found. They are construction dead, a category of loss that this country has never been good at remembering. Less than 3 weeks before the lighthouse was completed, the bark Lupatia was sailing in thick fog and high winds near Tillamook Rock. The crew of the construction team heard the panicked voices of the sailors through the fog. The lighthouse was not yet operational, but the workers placed lanterns in the unfinished tower and lit bonfires on the rock to warn the ship away. The Lupatia seemed to turn. She disappeared into the fog. The next morning, all 16 bodies of the crew washed up on Tillamook Head. Only the ship's dog survived. Tillamook Rocklight was officially lit on January 21, 1881. The tower stood 133 feet above sea level. The total cost was $123,000, which at the time made it the most expensive lighthouse ever built on the West Coast. The lighthouse was designed to house 4 keepers at a time, all male, with families forbidden from setting foot on the rock. 3 months on, 2 weeks off, 6 months of supplies stored inside. The first head keeper, Albert Roeder, lasted 4 months. The isolation, the storms, the constant noise of the fog signal, and the confinement broke men. The building that housed the keepers was 80 feet by 45 feet, perched on the flattened top of the basalt pillar, surrounded on all sides by the open Pacific. When the fog rolled in, the steam-powered fog signal blasted at regular intervals, a sound so loud and so persistent the keepers reported it in their skulls long after it stopped. Tensions between the men were inevitable. 4 men, locked in a stone building on a rock, unable to leave for 3 months, eating the same stored food, hearing the same horn, watching the same gray water. Some keepers came apart quietly. Others came apart loudly. The turnover rate in the early years was extraordinary. The keepers called it Terrible Tilly, and the nickname stuck because it was accurate. But some men stayed. If you are still here, if these names and these rocks and these stories mean something to you, subscribe. This channel exists because someone needs to say these names out loud. Charles Wesley Williams kept the light at Tillamook Rock for more than 20 years. Think about what that means. 20 years on a rock less than 1 acre in size, surrounded by the Pacific, battered by storms that sent waves over the top of the tower, shattering the Fresnel lens, flooding the rooms, throwing boulders into the building. In 1897, a telephone line was installed connecting the rock to the mainland. A storm cut it shortly afterward. In 1912, a storm sheared 100 tons of basalt off the western face of the rock itself. The ocean was not just attacking the lighthouse, it was eating the rock the lighthouse sat on. Williams stayed through all of it. He stayed because the light mattered. Ships were coming down the coast toward the Columbia River Bar, and if that light went dark, men would die on the rocks. Williams understood this in the way that only a man who has spent 20 years listening to the ocean can understand it. The light was not a job. It was an obligation to every soul on every ship that passed within 18 miles of that tower. Let me tell you what these men actually did, the physical work of keeping a light. A Fresnel lens is a precision optical instrument. The one at Tillamook Rock was a first-order lens, the largest size manufactured, standing roughly 6 feet tall and weighing several tons, including its housing and rotating mechanism. It focused the light from an oil lamp into a beam visible for 18 miles. The keeper's job was to keep that flame burning at the correct intensity, to keep the lens clean, to keep the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens properly wound, and to keep the fog signal operating when visibility dropped. The fog signal at Tillamook was a steam-powered horn fed by coal-fired boilers. When the fog rolled in, and on the Oregon coast the fog rolls in constantly, the keepers had to maintain those boilers around the clock. The horn blasted at regular intervals, shaking the walls, shaking the furniture, shaking the keepers' skulls. Men who served at fog signal stations reported difficulty sleeping, headaches, and a ringing in the ears that never fully went away. At Minot's ledge, the conditions were different, but no less brutal. The tower is essentially a granite tube, 114 feet tall. The lower 40 feet are solid stone. Above that, the keepers lived in a series of small circular rooms, stacked one above the other, connected by a spiral staircase so narrow that a man's shoulders brushed both walls. A storage room, a living room, a bedroom, the kitchen, the watch room, the lantern. The diameter of these rooms was roughly 12 feet. 2 or 3 keepers lived in this space for weeks at a time, unable to leave when the seas were rough, which was most of the time. Water entered the tower through every crack the ocean could find. The walls sweated condensation. The air smelled of oil and damp stone and wool and human habitation. The accumulated scent of men living in a granite cylinder with no ventilation except what the wind forced through the seams. During storms, the tower vibrated. Not swayed the way the iron tower had, vibrated. The granite held, but you could feel the force of the waves through the floor, through the walls, through your bones. Keepers reported that during the worst nor'easters, the vibration was strong enough to rattle dishes off shelves and knock pictures from the walls. The sound was like cannon fire, a deep concussion every time a wave hit the base, repeated every few seconds, for hours, sometimes for days. At Boone Island, the keepers at least had a separate dwelling, but the dwelling was barely adequate. The rock was so low and so exposed that storms deposited boulders on the island's surface, smashing outbuildings, flooding the house, cutting the keepers off from the tower itself. The blizzard of 1978 hit Boone Island with such force that 5 feet of water flooded the keeper's house, and boulders were scattered across the entire island. The keepers abandoned the house and took refuge inside the tower. They had to be rescued by helicopter. That was the storm that finally ended manned operations at Boone Island. The light was automated shortly afterward. Most American lighthouse keepers were retired by 1970. Automation replaced them. Electronic timers and solar cells and radio-controlled switches took over the work that men like Williams and the keepers at Minot's Ledge and Boone Island had done with their hands and their presence and their willingness to stay on the rock when every instinct said to leave. The transition was quiet. No ceremony for most of them. No parade. The Coast Guard simply informed the keepers that their services were no longer required. And the keepers packed their belongings and left the rocks they had lived on for years, sometimes decades. Some of them had raised children in lighthouse keepers' quarters on the mainland, while spending months at a time on offshore stations. Some of them had buried colleagues. Some of them had saved lives by keeping a flame burning through a storm that wanted to kill everything it touched. The last keeper to leave Tillamook Rock was Oswald Alec, who had started in the late 1930s and was serving as head keeper when the Coast Guard decommissioned the station on September 1, 1957. The final logbook entry at Tillamook Rock has been preserved, and the words carry the weight of a man who understood what was ending. It reads in part, according to the historical record, "Farewell, Tillamook Rock Light Station. An era has ended. With this final entry, and not without sentiment, I return thee to the elements. You, one of the most notorious and yet fascinating of the sea-swept sentinels in the world. Through howling gale, thick fog, and driving rain, your beacon has been a star of hope, and your foghorn a voice of encouragement. May the elements of nature be kind to you. Keepers have come and gone, men lived and died, but you were faithful to the end." Those are the words of a man who loved a rock, and I do not think that is a small thing. After decommission, Tillamook Rock Lighthouse was sold to private buyers. It changed hands several times. In 1980, a group of investors purchased it for $50,000 and converted it into a cremation columbarium called Eternity at Sea. They stored urns of human ashes inside the lighthouse. Roughly 30 urns were placed there before the Oregon Mortuary and Cemetery Board revoked the license in 1999 for inadequate record-keeping and improper storage. Today, Tillamook Rock Lighthouse sits empty, except for those 30 urns and the seabirds and the sea lions who have reclaimed the rock. You can still see it from the Oregon Highway, a white speck on a dark rock in the Pacific. The Fresnel lens is gone. The fog signal is silent. The keeper's quarters are gutted. But the tower is still standing. The basalt underneath has eroded, the western face sheared and battered. But the tower itself remains, because whoever built it understood what the ocean would do, and built it to withstand exactly that. Minot's Ledge has withstood waves estimated at over 100 feet tall. The strongest storms cause nothing more than a vibration. On some occasions, the sea has swept entirely over the top of the 114-foot structure, and the only damage was a few leaky windows. When inspectors examined the joints in 1867, 7 years after construction, they found every joint exactly as it had been laid, without flaw, without blemish, without weakness. The ocean had been trying for 7 years and had not moved a single stone. The tower is still there now. 166 years of Atlantic storms, and the granite holds. 1, 4, 3. I love you. I want to say something about what was lost. The men who built these lighthouses are mostly unnamed. We know Captain Barton Alexander. We know General Totten. We know the officers, the superintendents, the designers. But the stonecutters from Quincy who shaped 2,500 blocks of granite with hand tools and fitted them to tolerances that modern construction would struggle to match, their names are in no monument I can find. The quarrymen who dynamited the top of Tillamook Rock while living in wooden shacks on a wet basalt slope in the middle of the Pacific, with waves crashing over them and no rescue possible for days at a time, most of their names are lost. The 6 who died building Tillamook Rock are not individually recorded in any public archive I have been able to locate. We know Joseph Antoine and Joseph Wilson because they died in a way that made the newspapers. We know their names because the lighthouse they died in collapsed spectacularly, and the collapse forced the government to build a better one. Their deaths were useful in the cold calculus of institutional memory. The deaths of unnamed construction workers were not useful in the same way, and so they were not recorded with the same care. This is how America has always treated its laboring dead. If the death produces a lesson or a headline, the name survives. If the death is simply the cost of building something, the name is absorbed into the stone and forgotten. Every granite block in Minot's ledge was shaped by hands that held iron chisels and swung sledgehammers in the quarries of Quincy. Every block was lifted by men who operated hand-cranked derricks on a rock that tried to kill them every time the tide came in. Those men's labor is still visible. Their names are not. Charles Wesley Williams kept a light burning on Tillamook Rock for more than 20 years, and I had to search through multiple archives to find enough about him to say his name with confidence. William C. Williams served at Boone Island for 26 years, and his entry in the keeper's log is a line of text among dozens of other names, each one representing a man who spent years of his life on a rock in the ocean so that strangers on ships would not die. The keepers are mostly gone now. The last generation of manned lighthouse keepers in America retired in the 1970s and 1980s. Some are still alive, most are not. Their children remember, their grandchildren may remember. After that, unless someone tells the story, it becomes another fact in an archive that no one reads. Between 1850 and 1890, American engineers and laborers built a series of stone lighthouses on rocks that the ocean was actively trying to destroy. They did it with granite and iron and black powder and hand-cranked derricks and the physical strength of men who worked 90-minute shifts because the tide would not give them more. They built towers that have survived for over a century and a half. They built towers that still work. Minot's ledge still flashes 1, 4, 3. Boone Island light still flashes white every 5 seconds. The lights are automated now, controlled by electronics, powered by solar cells. But the granite is the same granite that the stonecutters of Quincy shaped in the 1850s. The dovetail joints are the same joints that Captain Alexander's crews fitted on a ledge they could only reach for 90 minutes at a time. The towers stand because the men who built them understood that the ocean does not forgive a mistake, and they did not make mistakes. I think about Joseph Antoine and Joseph Wilson often. I think about them ringing the fog bell as the iron tower swayed beneath them, knowing the structure was failing, knowing that no one was coming to save them, and choosing to keep the light burning anyway. I think about the unnamed quarrymen on Tillamook Rock, marooned for 16 days, rationing food, watching the Pacific tear at the rock they were trying to build on, and going back to work when the supplies finally arrived. I think about Charles Wesley Williams, 20 years on terrible Tilly, choosing the rock over the mainland, choosing the obligation over comfort, staying because the light mattered more than his own ease. These men did not think of themselves as heroes. They were workers. They were keepers. They were men who had a job and did it in conditions that would break most of us inside a week. The ocean was the opponent. The granite was the tool. The light was the purpose. If these stories matter to you, if you believe the names and the labor and the cost should be remembered, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel. These men deserve to be spoken of, not once, repeatedly, until their work is as well known as the towers they built. I will leave you with this. On a clear night, if you stand on the seawall at Cohasset, Massachusetts, and look southeast, you will see a light flashing on the horizon. One flash, a pause. 4 flashes, a pause. 3 flashes, a long pause. Then it starts again. 1, 4, 3. I love you. That is Minot's Ledge, built on a rock that kills ships, built by men who could work only 90 minutes a day, built from 2,500 blocks of granite, fitted with the precision of a watch. The men who built it are dead. The men who kept it are dead. The light is still burning. The granite holds.